considering street vending from vehicles ordinance. Do we have a roll call?
Councilmember Rouse. Here. Councilmember Gutierrez.
Present.
Madam Chair Snedden.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. And seeing no public comment on
We do
any
not.
item, if we could have a staff presentation.
Afternoon, Ordinance Committee, Assistant City Attorney John Doimus, presenting to you today the ordinance amending Chapter 532 and regarding street vending from vehicles. The first part I want to make clear with this ordinance is that this ordinance and the changes being made to this ordinance strictly deal with vending from vehicles from the streets. It doesn't deal with vending from push carts or other items on the sidewalk. And so what we wanted to do was take any reference to that and strike that from the current ordinance and strictly pertain and clean the ordinance and strictly pertain it to vehicles, vending from vehicles in the street. So the issue in regards to vending from sidewalks will be brought at a later date in the next coming weeks before the Ordinance Committee for sidewalk vending. And that, there have been a lot of rules proposed under Senate Bill 946 in which the legislature have decreed what we can and cannot regulate to that. So that ordinance will be respective of those regulations, and we'll bring that forth shortly. So originally, Chapter 5.32 is dealt with the entire, it was entirely our vending ordinance. There is also 948 that solely deals with sidewalk, but that also, as I said before, be brought before the Ordinance Committee when we deal with sidewalk vending. So 532 is our entire ordinance that deals with vending, whether it be from a street, from a vehicle. Apologize. Sorry for this. Is it working? Oh, it's this one, is it? All right, we can move to the next slide. I apologize for the... We can go to one more slide to the next one. The first question you may ask is, why are we bringing this forth? The way our ordinance is currently written is unenforceable. There was a case in 1993 entitled Barajas versus Anaheim that determined California cities cannot impose a blanket ban on prohibiting vending from vehicles in the street. And the reason was a preemption issue in terms of the vehicle code. The vehicle code provided that cities can regulate time, place, or safety issues. And so as now, and for we've been doing for years, we do not enforce this chapter when it comes to ending vending from any vehicles in the street. And so next slide, please. So to address potential safety issues by also being compliant with the court ruling in Barajas and state law, we've developed this ordinance that contains time, place, manner restrictions. We brought this ordinance 4 years ago in September 2015, and we brought forth proposed ordinances. Some are the same and some are fill in the blanks that we'll go over shortly. And the reason for the fill in the blanks was the Ordinance Committee at the time elected for us to go hold a workshop with vendors. So next slide. So we held a public workshop, and around at least 50 vendors attended. It was a Q&A in terms of also eliciting their reactions to the proposed draft. And the vendors did not have any problems with several of the aspects of the ordinance. They didn't have any problems with requiring the window side of the vending to be on the sidewalk instead of the street. They had no problem with no vending within 500 feet of a school when school is in session. They understood the safety issues in regards to that. No blocking sidewalks, having a trash receptacle by all times when they're vending. So those weren't any issues of concern. They did pinpoint, though, next slide. One more, sorry for that. They did pinpoint 3 areas of concern. One was the original ordinance had in place a 60-minute time limit to vend from one location of the city. And they expressed that that isn't enough time to vend. And the reason is that a lot of them said to set up sometimes takes an hour and to close up takes an hour. Having one hours is unrealistic. In effect, it's a de facto blanket prohibition. So with that, we understood at least at a minimum of 4 hours. But what I propose today is for the Ordinance Committee to elect the 4 hours, 8 hours, or even no time on that. At least in terms of respecting the terms of the vendors. So 4 hours would be a minimum, but the Ordinance Committee can consider longer or no limit, at least in terms of the limit being how long they could operate on streets. The second concern was restrictions on the vending hours. We had particularly from 7 a.m., I think, to 7 p.m., and they felt that that wasn't enough time. In fact, they wanted longer hours. A lot of times they would make up a lot of business serving people from late night in downtown district from leaving bars. So one of the suggestions that we have potentially you can consider is the same hours allowed for other businesses in that particular zone. And the third concern was the issue of a geographical boundary that we had in place. And it's in the proposed ordinance currently, and I'll get to that in a second. And a lot of it was in the downtown district. We cannot protect brick and mortar businesses. There's case law on that. It would have to be strictly for health safety regulations. So those streets do have high traffic, and there is one argument on one side that having vending and a crowd of people can be a safety issue. However, on the other side, an argument could be made that we already have our parking laws that would apply to all these vehicles, including our oversized vehicle ordinance. So, it's a balancing test, and it's something that the Ordinance Committee can consider to keep in place those restrictions and those geographical, or do away with it and rely upon our current parking laws. So the proposed changes. And that was I just talked about the restricted area. So the proposed changes, I think, from the what I developed from the public workshop with staff is that there is no opposition in the ordinance when it comes to the regulations of not being near schools or 500 feet from schools when it's in session, vending from the sidewalk side, having trash receptacles available for people so the garbage isn't thrown around the sidewalk, nothing to block or impede pedestrian traffic, and the areas of concern for street vendors were concerns about time limit. So that's an option that could be discussed, and I'm happy to entertain questions on that. In one location, not having a geographical boundary to eliminate, at least at this time. If it becomes an issue, we can always amend it. And also proposing the hours of operation to whatever zone it is, right? So, or it could be something of a mix that 7 a.m. or 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. in a residential zone, and in business areas, what the zone allows, or some flexibility, or maybe downtown business, 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. So we could differentiate between residential zones and business zones. So there is a lot to discuss on this, on at least those particular three issues, as well as anything else you have, and I'd be happy to address any questions you may have. And I apologize for the slides. I'm used to sitting over there, so next time, so I know I went out of sequence on it.
Thank you, Mr. Doimus. We do have questions first from Councilmember Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Doimus, on the Senate bill law that you referred to about that, was that where the California state law pertains to not interfering with the brick and mortar business?
No, there's case law in terms of when we're having regulations, the regulations shouldn't be focused on protecting brick and mortar businesses for vending, whether it be from vehicle or sidewalk. It should be strictly for example, health safety concerns or appropriate time, place, manner restrictions. But one of the considerations in making those determinations shouldn't be the economic impact it would have in a brick and mortar business.
Because I know that part of the Lara law regarding push cards specifically called that out, but is that dovetailing with that same restriction?
It dovetails. It's consistent with case law and everything else in terms of that. And so we are in very safe ground by making sure that we make no findings that we're, with this ordinance, that we're trying to do so, that it's strictly any restrictions we have are more geared towards the health and safety impacts that it may have.
And what type of regulatory licensing does a particular vehicle have to have in order to do business on the city streets of Santa Barbara?
Sure. With that question, right now, currently, we would have to have a business tax license. If they're selling food, they would have to get a health permit from the county, as well as if they are selling food, they have to be within 200 feet of a restroom people can wash their hands. So, and that's state law. So, but to answer the first two questions, it would be business license, and if it's food, a permit from the county.
So it's a Santa Barbara City business license as well as a Santa Barbara County health permit. Because I remember
Correct.
when this subject crossed our dais before, part of the concerns from some of the brick and mortar people were the fact that were on weekends there would be a number of vendors from out of town that would come in and sell, and that was, upsetting to the local brick and mortar people. But once again, the brick and mortar wouldn't really apply. It would have to be based on their licensing. So if you were in, for example, Ventura County, and you came up and you had a City of Santa Barbara license, you would be in compliance.
If you had a business license, correct, you would be in compliance.
As well as a county.
And also, the one thing in terms of concern, right now, nothing in this ordinance, if someone were to do it, we have nothing to enforce on. We couldn't cite them for illegal vending because our law has a current blanket prohibition, so if someone were to challenge it, it would not hold up in court the way the law is currently written.
But in the public right-of-way or on a public street, the oversized vehicle ordinance would still apply.
It would still apply, and I think that's an important point to consider, because what you don't want to have is you want to apply it equally across the board. You don't want to have discrimination that we allow commercial businesses, but someone in their vehicle can't do so. It needs to apply facially neutral and equal across the board.
And then my last question is, as I recall, some of the issues that came up before was, if, for example, there's a food vendor working from a truck, what are their restrictions in terms of the perimeter of the area, in terms of like tables, chairs, outdoor furnishings, that type of thing?
So the ordinance itself, they are not to block pedestrian pathways. So it's really to just be able to have a trash receptacle ready. It could be either attached to the truck or it could be close to it, but not to be setting up tables or anything else on that. And the vendors we talked to at the public workshop did not want to, because that's a different issue from vending in your truck when you're setting up tables. You're not vending from your truck anymore when you're doing something like that.
But you could theoretically, if there were a parkway strip between the curb and the public sidewalk, would that be considered the public right-of-way, or is that just a parkway strip? Or because you mentioned putting up trash receptacles.
True, that would be considered the public right-of-way, that kind of geographic location right there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Gutierrez?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As of right now, aren't most food trucks supposed to operate on private property? Because I don't really see them on the street. I see them in parking lots.
That's a really good question, Madam Chair, Councilwoman Gutierrez. We, in around 2016, we passed an ordinance regarding vending on private property. So we already have an ordinance in place that deals with those issues. So this one is strictly would deal with on the public streets, but we already have an ordinance in place that deals with vending on private property. One of the concerns we went to the public workshop was sometimes schools, in terms of meals for children, there are some services that provide food trucks, for that particular type of program. And the answer to that's really easy. That what they would do in that situation is park in the parking lot, which for the school, which would be safer for the kids, and they're not being in the street trying to get to the food truck. So we already have an ordinance that deals with vending. And so the majority we do see, at least in the city, is on private property. And like I said, one of the reasons why we waited a couple years with this was looking to see where the state law went with vending, as well as it's not really a major issue here in terms of the amount of vending that's occurring on streets as you see somewhere like Los Angeles or other communities.
So how many food vendors are operating on public streets as opposed to private property?
We don't have numbers on that, Madam Chair, Councilmember Gutierrez. We don't have numbers on that that would identify that. But as I said, at least in the public workshop, I was surprised that there were a good number that came. Now, some were operating in the city already. Some were wondering if they would invest and wanted to see if the law would impact their decision. Some were from surrounding communities too that were somewhat interested. But in terms of the actual numbers, we don't have like a permitting program that would be able for us to identify how many we would have.
And what's their time restraint, the vendors on the private property?
From Madam Chair, Councilmember Gutierrez, from what I recall on the under the zoning ordinance, I believe I'm not 100% sure. I know it doesn't have like a 1 or 2 hours constraint, but it does have certain hours of operation, whether it's 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. I can include that information if this ordinance were to proceed forward, or and get that information and make sure what the distinction is on that, but I'm not 100% certain on that.
And right now, the time restraint, there is no time restraint for street vending as of now?
As of now, there's nothing prohibiting it. So if someone were to do it, we couldn't issue them a citation under our ordinance. There's nothing that would make it illegal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And then I have some clarifying questions.
Sure.
I think I was asking you ahead of time, too. So on page 1, where it does have the mention of wagon or push carts, in section 1A, would we recommend striking that so that it's not referring to?
Yes, Madam Chair, I recommend striking that because the intent of this ordinance is to strike any reference to any type of containers or devices that you would use normally on a sidewalk, like a wagon and push cart. So I would strike that from the findings and purposes.
Okay, thank you. And that actually framed a lot of my questions from then on throughout the ordinance of why it would pertain to those. So that clears that up. And then I had a question about item 2, A2 under prohibited types of peddling and soliciting.
Mm-hmm.
And could you just talk about the recommendation about turning off music or other notifying bells? I'm thinking of ice cream trucks.
Sure. One of the concerns that staff had was you were having a whole group of food trucks or vending trucks, whatever it may be, whatever they're selling, and having music or bells, and the collective of such sound could create a disturbance. We could modify that to essentially say that the vending truck shall not violate the city's noise ordinance, and I believe that would be usually 60 decibels. So we can change that, but at least that was the collective of not having that in there. And the time manner restriction for that is just the noise pollution if we had a large amount of vending trucks in one area congregated to prevent such noise. So that was the basis for putting that in there.
Thank you. And then for the parking issue, so as it is, or as it's proposed, if a truck has a license, and any number of trucks have licenses, they can pull into any open parking space?
Correct.
And are they able to block off that parking space ahead of time, or do they come and drive in on spec that someplace will be open?
Madam Chair, there's no process to reserve it. If they see an open space that will allow it, that's not prohibited, like a red curb or zone parking or particular like that, they can park right in there and stay for how long they want to. And so that was one of the arguments. That's a really good question. That was one of the arguments that was raised at the public workshop, is that right now, why do I have to move if it's a space that doesn't have any time limits? That way, if I'm first come first serve, I don't have to worry about, I'm there, I can stay all day, I can set up and not worry about issues with competing vendors trying to fight over a same spot. So and they said it runs smoothly that way. So it was an issue that we considered and realized they actually had a great point on that issue.
Thank you. And then I had a question, if you could explain the reasoning for, it's item A4, it's on page 3, about being in the same location, and then, is this where it is? Yes, the path as the crow flies and the 500 feet being counted as a single location. Would that still be an issue if they didn't have to move in a certain time period?
That's an excellent question. If they did not have to move within a certain time period, then we would if that's the ordinance committee's recommendation, that section would be stricken, because there has to be some recognition of that. And one way was to regulate the spaces and everything else, the issues about having long-standing vendors in one location and what impact that could have in that area. But if we don't have a time restriction, then it would be logical to continue with that section.
So is this to prevent people from just moving forward one space, moving
correct.
back one space? Okay.
Correct.
Okay. If we have no further questions, Councilmember Rouse?
Kind of a question, kind of a comment at this point in time, because I remember going back through this and when we addressed this before, a lot of the things about time restrictions, hours of operations, and things like music were mostly about neighborhood impacts. I mean, certainly in the downtown, you often have either a 75 or 90-minute restriction on the parking space in any case, and of course we have our oversized vehicle ordinance. I know that the thing about the 7 p.m. was related mostly to neighborhoods where trucks would be on the public street. Now, certainly the private parking lot, there wasn't a restriction per se, but there were neighborhood concerns about something being open late and making noise or drawing attention in a crowd. Now, staff has recommended this elimination of the time period in general. And I do know that, once again, reaching back to what we talked about before, there were some concerns just about establishing a pop-up business on the same place at the same time. And in fact, we did change some street time to parking designations based on that. So I don't know what the utility is or is not of a time restriction. I do know that the idea behind a food truck is that it's mobile and it moves around and it does have places to go, but if it sets up in the same place at the same time for 8, 10, or 12 hours in a day, it's essentially a brick and mortar on wheels. So I'm kind of wondering, did we go there because of the enforceability aspect of trying to enforce a time restriction? Is that kind of part of the staff logic there?
No, Madam Chair, Councilmember Rouse, these are really good questions, and that's kind of what the debate here is for. I think this ordinance, there are two issues. This ordinance came back in 2015, and a lot has changed in state law in terms of sidewalk vending, but some of it we can look to in terms of how we look to apply the economic opportunity that comes with vending, whether it be from a vehicle or whether it be from a push cart. Some of those same principles still apply in terms of what SB 946 was purposely, the intent of that ordinance, to provide such an economic opportunity. So we originally had such regulations for the reasons that you said, to regulate and to not cause disturbances in the neighborhood, to worry about congestion and congregation in terms of certain areas. And at the same time, when we did the workshop, when the Ordinance Committee thought to do that, there were concerns that none of us who are running a food truck would really understand, and that was a great idea because we needed to hear from them. I have no clue in terms of how long it would take to do a setup for food, and so that was the intent of that. And so this ordinance, I think, the reason why I wanted to present it to you, and present it even in this form with some unusual fill in the blanks in terms of what staff recommendation is, to at least show an almost finished product to get further input. So if we do have something, we can take it to council, because on the time, place, manner restrictions, there are truly policy issues to consider, and there are balancing equations. The right to vend, by also at the same time worrying about some health, safety feature, specific regulations to not disturb residential neighborhoods, to worry about impacts of having a vending at one location at such a long time. Would that have such environmental impact or everything else? So is it fair to allow someone to do 4, 6, 8 hours? Yeah. Is it fair to allow all day in terms of the impact? That's a decision that at least we wanted the Ordinance Committee's input on this, and this is something that at least what I can foresee is coming back again to you with some more concrete terms, but getting in this discussion and filling in those final blanks that need to be filled in.
Well, we're certainly not unique in terms of municipalities that have addressed this issue, in fact, all over the country, but I know Mr. Colon had to deal with it down in Ventura. A lot of that was to do with brick and mortar competition, but the other side of the coin is I do have a letter here from the FPPC regarding my participation. It basically finds that there was no economic impact, there was no significant, particularly if you don't have a concentration, if you have the separation of units. So I don't really think that's a consideration, particularly in light of the state law as has been interpreted now about whether or not these vendors do actually, in fact, compete or if it's even an issue. So I've got no problem with that, but I do want to have some consistency. I do want to have some, the concerns, this will probably be, like you say, a hearing that's going to come back as this gets out in the public and we start talking about it more. I don't see there being a huge problem right now. I don't think there's that many of these vehicles around at the moment. But who knows, that could change. But I think it's important that we have something that's a template going forward that at least is consistent for people that both in the business and from the community as well.
Councilmember Gutierrez?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Has there been a lot of complaints locally of these street vendors? Has there been like service calls to them or anything like that?
Madam Chair, Councilwoman Gutierrez, there have been some complaints, as we've told people that we obviously don't enforce the actual act of vending because we can't. Though some of these vending trucks have been that have been parked have been in violation of our oversized vehicle ordinances. So there have been citations on that issue. But as far as vending, we do not cite. I think maybe in the last 3 years, there's been one or two by accident that's caught my attention, and we dismissed it right away.
Okay. As of right now, I don't see this as a huge issue that we could be enforcing upon. I like to think that we can be a community that supports entrepreneurship, and street vending would definitely be an option for that. So as of now, I don't really see this being a huge issue to be enforcing upon. That's all I got to say.
Thank you. Mr. Doimus, I have a question. We've been talking about food trucks. What are some other things that could be vended?
It could be someone selling T-shirts or hoodies or food or not food, sorry, furniture, wares or. So there is no distinction between what in this ordinance of what is sold. The only additional requirement would be state law, like I said earlier, about requiring someone, if they're selling food, to be within 200 feet of a restroom where people can wash their hands. But outside of that, there's no distinction in this ordinance of what they would sell. But people sell, I've seen furniture, I've seen knickknacks, I've seen, T-shirts.
And what are the current laws on, say, a mobile pot truck?
The current laws would be the same in terms of cities can regulate time, place, manner restrictions. So there could be two directions, I think, where I'm hearing too from this committee. There could be one to think of rules to place in here, or there could be a second in order to clean up the ordinance. Because the one thing the ordinance does need cleaning up is it prohibits vending from the street. So at least that part somehow would be, we have an ordinance that's outdated from 1993 if you look at the case law. So that could be another direction that the ordinance committee could give me as well.
Thank you. And then one more question. How confident are you that the workshop input is up to date? Have there been many changes in vending since that time?
Madam Chair, in thinking of that question carefully, I don't think I could ever be confident of something that's 4 years ago. So if I'm requested with staff to hold another workshop, I'd be glad to do that, to get further input on these issues, saying we heard you, this was brought to the Ordinance Committee, and give us more input in terms of give us times, give us suggestions on that as well.
Would that include input from residents as well?
It would be open to the public, absolutely.
I was sort of waiting for today to see if there was a outcry of public comment, and seeing none, I'm wondering how much it is in the understanding of people that this is coming before us.
Madam Chair, that's actually a great question. I'm actually probably have the same concern you do because of that, considering there was at least more outreach. So what I can do is to, ensure, work with staff to ensure there is one too. So there's a lot of options at least to give me a directive on this issue.
Thank you. Councilmember Rouse.
Yeah, Mr. Doimus, in terms of using the paid public parking lots, could one pull in there, set up shop, and do business in one of those? Per this ordinance?
No, they could not do it per this ordinance. That would be our public shopping lots are reserved for parking, not commercial activities. So we could prohibit that activity if it's the public.
Right, and that,
Unless it's a permitted event.
is that part of our posting in those lots, or is that just part of the municipal code?
I believe that's, Madam Chair, Councilmember Rouse, I believe that's part of the municipal code.
All right, because I remember one of our concerns was also just the public use of the right-of-way, and that had to do with either vending, things like setting up even valet stops on the public right-of-way or streets, blocking bike lanes and whatnot, and I think that, along with other municipalities' examples, is why we talked about not a central business district per se is the way we've got it defined today, but these parameters as if they were here. Now, staff recommends that we not have these prohibitions on the limits. Is that how I'm reading this? Or?
No, staff recommends at least from the input of the workshop that it gives the option of council or the ordinance committee to direct policy. I think there is no dispute on some of these, right? The school issues, blocking sidewalks, having the vending window on the sidewalk side. Those are safe options. There was no opposition at all in the public workshop on that. The three areas of concern were the time limit in one area, not having a restriction in the city where they cannot vend, and even if they could legally park there. And the third being that the hours of total operation when they can be in business. Those are the three areas where we did receive. No one of the public workshops asking to be allowed to vend at 2 a.m, but they do want longer hours than was originally proposed.
All right, very good.
Okay, well, I'll agree that there are some things in here that seem they could be cleaned up, like the 500 feet from schools, not obstructing sidewalks, having a sales window on the sidewalk side, that's for safety, providing trash receptacles, that seems perfectly reasonable. The playing music and bells and other loud noises, I think certainly we don't want loud noises, but ice cream trucks I feel like should be able to still ring their bell. The time limit on one location, I do agree that 1 hour is too short, and somewhere between 4 and 8 hours could be recommended. I would like to hear from vendors if that seems suitable, but it seems clear that they would ask for the maximum amount that we would consider. I agree with Councilmember Gutierrez that we want to be welcoming to businesses operating in this way. I agree with the recommendation to keep the hours the same as other businesses in a particular zone. Otherwise, it seems to impact neighborhoods and other businesses also. So in these proposed changes, can you pull into a residential area and park your truck and set up shop?
Madam Chair, yes, you could pull into a residential area. There is no, and that was one of the concerns, I think, why we wanted to have some regulations, and what Councilmember Rouse said, the concern too, in terms of having certain regulations with that. So we could have a separation in terms of hours of operation within residential neighborhoods as compared to non-residential. The reason why it hasn't been so much of a concern in residential neighborhoods, outside of maybe ice cream trucks that patrol the neighborhoods, is you're not going to generate too much business by being in a residential versus in a more business district where people are traveling by foot.
Well, it might depend on what you're selling.
True. True.
And that's my concern,
True.
that we will start having businesses, not food trucks. I'm okay with food trucks, but when you start talking about all the different things that could be sold, it raises a different concern for me. So I do think this needs some further discussion, or are we ready to make some recommendations on some of these items, or? all? Councilmember Rouse?
I just, talking about obviously there's the iconic ice cream bell, the ice cream truck. The good part about ice cream trucks is they tend to function during the daytime, and they don't tend to continue their bell playing when they're stopped. I think that was one of the things. Certainly, if you looked at it de novo today, you're going, oh my God, you're going to have kids running out into the middle of the street to go to the ice cream truck, but it's part of how we all grew up, so I don't think anybody wants to necessarily change that. The restriction at night, I think, at the time, we talked about it because there was a lot of activity on the west side, particularly in the neighborhoods, and the neighbors were complaining about these guys coming and pulling up just on streets. Now, there's one that parks in that parking lot right off of Mitchell Train on a regular basis, and I think that's a pretty regular occurrence, and I think everybody's fine with that because it's far enough away from other residences and next to an adjacent business. But I do think the 7 p.m. restriction was about that, and I do think that Chair Sneddon's comments are correct about we're talking about food trucks, but there's a lot of other vending types of activities out there that we certainly don't want to just go Wild West on. So I think we could move these proposed changes. I do think it's going to be a broader discussion at council, and I do think I'll be actually curious to see what the public hearing in front of council is like. Last time we did this 3 years ago, it was pretty packed house in here.
Correct.
Not a whole lot of activity today. So I would personally move the recommendations, and then the proposed changes. I would still use a 7 p.m. on the vending hours, and I would say let me just add at least 4 hours, just to start the discussion. So that would give a fair shake to the vendors, but also give notice that we're talking about maybe some kind of time limit, and for the full body to speak on that. That would be my motion, Madam Chair.
Councilmember Rouse, to clarify, for the 7 p.m., that would be for the ending of operations, or
Right.
Okay, I think they could go. Personally, I think they could go a little later than that to be the regular business hours of whatever the area is zoned for, same as the other businesses in the particular zone. For a food truck, 7 o'clock is really early to be closing.
Well, once again, the prohibitions we're talking about in the areas that are active late at night outside of the neighborhoods usually wouldn't benefit a food truck because of the parking restrictions, as well as, and of course our health and human safety concerns about blocking busy sidewalks, busy thoroughfares. Certainly you'd want to be on State Street or thereabouts after that time if you were going to be stay open that late, and that's not an issue.
Or Milpas.
Or on Milpas, but once again, parking along the street in Milpas is going to be problematic. So,
Could that be something that the business could decide for themselves, whether it was to their advantage to
well,
stay
I
open or not?
just would like to protect the sanctity of the neighborhoods, because once again, this really did come up on the west side at that point in time. So, and I don't know how much activity there is these days regarding that, but that was the reasoning behind that restriction. So, I think either we have to remain consistent or we have to divide it up into districts. I don't know if zones like the restricted zone we're talking about and residential zones. I don't know if that's the kind of detail we want to get into on this ordinance, or.
Well, Madam Chair, Councilmember Rouse, Councilmember Gutierrez, if I can make a recommendation of a possibility. This conversation is exactly what I was looking for in terms of this. What I could do in terms of presenting to council is, you said, having that discussion, interested in having that discussion and making sure public receives more notice. Vendors that we have on the old list get notification of this hearing, is to have a proposal of, I think what we kind of did with the building codes is an A and B proposal, right? In terms of A being the restrictions in the geographical areas, or B, option B is no restrictions. In terms of the hours, we could have option A being 4, option B being 8, option C being none, at least, right, for the council to look at, or and I'm just throwing some ideas out because I realize it's also a difficult position be placed into in terms of some of the issues that I've asked for today. But I did want to hear from the Ordinance Committee how they felt about these issues.
Well, then, Madam Chair, should we direct, rather than do a motion, direct the city attorney to prepare something along those lines where you give us that menu of options to discuss, and then move this entire thing over to full council for discussion?
This is what I'm wondering also. I do have a question for the committee. If sometimes when there are too many options and a lot of public comment all in the same meeting, it might not give us the fullest amount of information ahead of time. And I'm wondering if we might want to have a workshop where the public can weigh in, vendors can weigh in. I feel like maybe a lot has changed in the last 5 years in terms of how this business is perceived and also how it works in the neighborhoods. And that might give us a more specific recommendation from ordinance to bring to council without having so many wide options, or to narrow down our options here amongst ourselves so that we're not having the complete suite of openness and public comment at the same meeting.
I get your point, Madam Chair. The one concern I have is what we're trying to do is also clean up an unenforceable ordinance. So that's why the Part A-B may make sense, because the first thing we have to do is strike the stuff in the ordinance we have today that's not enforceable and not in compliance with state code. And we all and of course with the Barajas decision of 1993 as well. So I think that's important to go ahead and move forward on. And then as far as the other kinds of things, we certainly could, I suppose, go for public outreach or a workshop. I hate to and give staff yet one more assignment for us to get through. But I do think we need to at least clean up the ordinance for the sake of consistency with state law.
Councilmember Gutierrez?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just haven't heard too much about this issue from any of the residents, especially on the west side. I'm assuming that at some point in time it was an issue, but now now I don't see it, There's Don Pepe's on the corner of Mediterranean and San Andres, and that's kind of become like a meeting space for people to come out and talk and socialize, which is pretty important right now, especially for the people that live on the west side. So I just don't see this as a pressing issue at this time for us to spend staff time and staff resources. I would be willing to support another workshop just to see if things have changed for the vendors and the residents, and just get more input on it before we take it to council. That would be my recommendation.
May I ask staff what the timeline on that would be? The last time it was sent to workshop, it's now 5 years later.
I'm not going to make it a presidential term cycle. Madam Chair, Ordinance Committee, I would do that we have emails from people who went to it previously, so hopefully some of those work, and we'll post it on our website. So we can do within, I think, a 2-month period would be fair. And what it would allow me to do is present the 3 options. It'll be really centrally focused in the workshop on the 3 issues that remain. And then that way I can not only bring the results, but then concrete, fill in those blanks myself to see if the Ordinance Committee would choose to go forward on those or not. So I think I'm perfectly fine with that. So I would request about a 2-month period.
Thank you. And then, so we'll see if that's our recommendation. And then also if we could move through some of these that really are cleanup items and that aren't these 3 main issues, perhaps we could vote to move those forward so that those are cleaned up and done, and we're just focusing on the question of hours and locations if we were to move forward with a public workshop, and then hoping for not a long turnaround for it to come back just with that input. Do we have interest here in, I'd be interested in moving forward the initial proposed changes, the no vending within 500 feet of a school while in session, prohibition on obstructing pedestrian and other vehicles using sidewalk, requiring vendors to have the window on the sidewalk side of the vehicle, providing trash receptacles. I suppose, except for ice cream trucks, I think playing music, I guess, if you do get too many and it's too loud. But maybe that's something we could hear from neighbors about. I would like to move those forward as not still in play, if that is amenable to the committee.
Yeah, I'd be fine with that, Madam Chair, once again, because it is while standing or parked. So that's the thing. What we don't want is for trucks to pull up and start doing boom boxes and whatever to attract attention to themselves. So the little bell thing would be just dandy while they're driving. The other proposed changes, like I say, they were the ones that brought this out. One of the things that brought us out in the first place was we had a citywide ban, which was not enforceable. So I suppose whatever we do, we have to rescind that part of the ordinance.
Absolutely.
In any case. And then I still would like to tee up at some point, and perhaps this is a post-workshop thing, the idea about the zones and where you could be. And then restrictions or vending hours. I know there's not an issue currently, but like I said, there was at one time. And food trucks have to go where there's going to be a gathering of people, and that's usually not a residential neighborhood. That's usually an event. We have to watch out for things like the Sunday art walk and those kinds of things where people can take advantage of somebody else's crowd. So that was all the kind of the emotion behind that, and the people that brought this to us in the first place. So without trying to compete or to violate or to be in any issue with state law or brick and mortar vendors, those were issues as well. I brought together this crowd, and then you showed up with your. Might not even be food. Like I say, it might be any kind of, pots and pans or whatever people want to sell. So I agree, Madam Chair. We'll go ahead and we could move these items that are proposed changes.
Including at least 4 hours. I think we were in agreement that.
Yeah, we would use the word at least 4 hours in order just to start the conversation. Restriction on vending hours. I'd like to go there, but if the Ordinance Committee doesn't want to go there, I can see that. And then in terms of the specific city streets and whatnot, I think that input from PD and or traffic engineering would be good for that, because there are certain streets that we may not be thinking of right now that would be kind of a disaster if a food truck or some kind of mobile van pulled over and sold their wares there.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Rouse, that's a really good point. What I failed to mention during my presentation, that original map actually predates our oversized vehicle. That was a lot where our RV parking prohibition, because a lot of those streets were narrow, and so a lot of those streets were concerns from safety issues of having larger vehicles there. But why it may not be an issue, and it's an issue to debate, is our oversized vehicle ordinance supply. So if you have a vending truck that's smaller, that is maybe that's why it's not a health and safety issue anymore. Something to recognize on.
Right, because I was thinking specifically about parking RVs on De La Vina and what a disaster that is. Mm-hmm. So okay, so you're probably it may be moot point now.
It could very well be. Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Things change in 4 years apparently.
So if if you think that's close enough to a motion, I would support it.
I think it's close enough to a motion, Mr. Duenas.
I have clear direction in terms of starting the conversation with the vendors of at least 4 hours and getting input, looking at the input of hours of operation, if there needs to be a separation between residential neighborhoods and business districts for those, and bringing that forth, and then the issue and making it concrete for you on whether we don't need a restriction area, because it could be a moot point with our oversized vehicle ordinance.
Yes, and updating that information from PD. That's excellent recommendation. Do we have a second for that motion? And if not, I'll second. Okay. And just to be clear, it's to move forward with the recommendations that do not have to deal with hours or with zones, and to have public outreach on those items and come back to ordinance with a recommendation.
Ordinance. Motion, I think, was at least 4 hours. So
with at least 4 hours.
Right.
Okay. I believe we're ready for a vote.
Councilmember Gutierrez.
No.
Councilmember Rouse.
Yep.
Madam Chair Snedden.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we are adjourned.